One of the things that I really love about storytelling is that there's all these different levels of connection. My nickname is Fox, in part because when I was a little boy, I had a pet fox who lived with us for a while. We had all kinds of pets. My house was a zoo growing up. And I love the image of the fox in folklore. And people always ask, how'd you get the name Fox? And it's a childhood nickname, but I developed this hour-long performance that answers that question. And I actually begin with a Maudu Nisenan, California tribe, Indian creation myth about how Fox sings the world into being. And the world is made of song and story. And then I tell a true story of my great-great-uncle who had a pet fox, and about fox hunting in the Cherokee Mountains in North Carolina, Tennessee, which is where my ancestors are from, where my dad grew up. My dad was born and raised 8 miles from Davy Crockett. And then I tell some fox fables. And then I tell the true story of my pet fox. And then only at the very end do I tell the story of how I got the name. And so in this hour-long performance, very little of it is about me until the very end. And I thought this was somewhat clever. But then I read Black Hawk's autobiography. And he begins with the first couple of chapters. It's the tribal history of the Sauk Nation. And he doesn't come in until later because he couldn't separate his own small story from the ongoing story of Creator. This is the same thing Geronimo did. After Geronimo was finally caught or gave himself up, he was being interviewed about his autobiography, and he began with the creation myth of the Apache because he could not separate himself from the ongoing story of creation. And stories connect us on a very personal level with who we are, with the layers of our family history and our parents and grandparents, because we all have these funny stories about our Aunt Martha or Uncle Joe, and all the way back into those layers of cultural history and where our ancestors came from, all the way back to the dawn of time. And so it's through these stories that we see these layers of connection with who we are in this small sense. As I love to tease parents when I do my family night at schools, who we are is more than a bag of bones. Who we are, the stories of our parents, great-great-great-grandparents, because you know and I know that our great-great-grandmother made choices that brought us here. You know, if our grandma would have changed her mind that night, we wouldn't even be here. More than the color of our hair and the shape of our nose, our ancestors' stories brought us to this place. And they give us that bigger sense of who we are and where we came from. On another level, stories help us to connect us with a very profound sense of place. Because everywhere we are, there are stories. You know, the cinder block wall here behind me tells the story of a Devonian sea. And the limestone that it's made out of is full of fossils that tell that story of that ancient world that lived here before us. And so stories, for me, help to bring science concepts to life. I do a lot of work in environmental education, the Department of Natural Resources, the Environmental Protection Agency. This afternoon I'm going to the Field Museum in Chicago to do some programming. Because stories bring those science concepts to life. And if you think about science education, as the way I like to think about it, first off, we think about facts. And stories make the facts really fun. The fact that a pronghorn antelope can run 60 miles an hour, zoom, that's just amazing to me. But if I just tell you that fact, I'm not teaching science. Science, in my mind, is a verb. It's something you do. It's about asking questions and looking for answers. And stories bring those concepts to life. You know, why does a pronghorn antelope run so fast? Because it had a predator that used to chase it that much. And why would it be pushed to coevolution is the concept. But the truth is, there's no predator in North America that comes close to 60 miles an hour. And so you have to ask and then look for answers. And even in this short example, it's about process. It's about asking those questions. Why does a pronghorn antelope run 60 miles an hour? And in a story, you can teach the facts. You can introduce the concepts like evolution, but more important, you can model the process. Through a story, you can look over the shoulder of the scientist and invite them, the audience, to participate in this process. One of the things that I often do with audiences is I ask them to formulate an hypothesis. Right in the middle of the story, I engage 300 kids in discovery. And then I'll conduct research. I'll choose some kids to be the control group, which means I'm not going to monkey with you. The rest of you are my guinea pigs, but don't worry, I believe in the ethical treatment of animals. And I'll conduct research with the audience in the middle of the story so that they're part of that scientific process. And they're learning how to think like a scientist by telling the stories of the great scientists. You know, Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, these are some of my heroes. And I tell their stories, and the audience gets to participate in that discovery with them. So it's no longer a list of facts or just some abstract concepts, but using the stories, they learn the facts, the concepts, and the scientific process. So I tell stories to professional scientists. You know, Walter the Water Molecule is a story I've used with a room full of PhD aquatic ecologists. And they love it as much as the preschoolers. Because even in early elementary education, you need to know, you know, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and collection, and those 4 steps. And often I'll get the audience to say that with me. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and collection. So they've learned the concept and been involved in the scientific process through the course of that story. But also, basic literacy, the way the brain works. There's a lot of really cool brain research that affirms what storytellers have known forever. That the way we know ourselves and our connection to the world is through story. That it's narrative that really makes us think and how we think. We are constantly ingesting the world through our own personal narrative. And we actually have 2 stories that we tell. One is the one that we tell ourselves, and one is the one we tell the public. And so we have this one story that we tell to our friends, but then we also have that personal story that we keep inside. And I know that everyone here has done this before, that when you do something really cool, in the back of your head, you're even kind of rehearsing, how are you going to tell that story? And so it's through that narrative that we assimilate and accommodate information. We take new information and make room for it, or we take new information and fit it in with what we already know, that ongoing personal narrative. In early childhood education, lots of research to affirm that oral language development is the first and most important step towards better reading and writing. If you've never heard the word in the dynamic context of a story, then it's not in your sight vocabulary. But when you've heard the word in a story, then when you see it in text, when you see it in your textbook, that word now makes sense because you've got a palpable experience of that word. And they actually did a study in England where they read aloud to kids. And reading aloud is wonderful, and I really encourage teachers to read aloud. The same group of kids, that same story, they told it dramatically, put the book down and acted it out with vocal changes and facial expression. And they did pre- and post-testing on vocabulary. And the kids who were read aloud to, their vocabulary improved, because reading aloud is good stuff. But the kids who heard the story dramatically interpreted, their ability to comprehend and retain new vocabulary words was much better than the kids who were simply read aloud to. And my interpretation of the study is that meaning is more than black ink on white paper. That meaning is about facial expression. Meaning is about gesture. Meaning is about vocal inflection. Also, when you're telling the story, you're watching them watch the story. That's actually my favorite part of my job. Watching the audience watch the story. And there's this dance that we're doing. And you can see the look in their eyes when they get it. And if they don't, you explain it. You add an explanatory clause to that big word that they didn't get. Or if they look bored, then you change it and make it funnier. And if they're excited, then you keep going and follow that stream. And often, go off on a tangent because they're with you and that's where they want to go. So sometimes you're leading the dance, sometimes you're following. And the story is the music that helps us to kind of share that experience together. On another level, Albert Einstein is well known for his quote that imagination is more important than knowledge. It's not just what you know, but how you use it. They analyzed his brain, and it's smaller than average. But what they found was unique was the integration of left and right hemisphere, the neural synapses. And when they hook electrodes to children's brains, their brain is firing all over the place. Generally, when kids are watching TV, they use very little of their brain because the television feeds them so much image that they don't have to think. But those same kids watching storytelling, their brain's firing all over the place because they have to make their own pictures. They have to imagine on a multi-sensory layer. When you're